Story number 1. The Cabin in the Night. Norway's wilderness is vast and untamed, a place where the line between reality and myth often blurs. My boyfriend, Mark, and I had always loved the outdoors, and the idea of camping deep in the Norwegian forest during the autumn season seemed like the perfect getaway. The air was crisp, the trees painted in fiery reds and oranges, and the silence of the forest was a welcome reprieve from the constant hum of city life. We hiked for hours that day, choosing a spot far from any marked trail. The clearing we found was idyllic, flat ground surrounded by towering pines, with a small brook running nearby. We pitched our tent as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. By the time the fire was crackling and dinner was ready, the stars had come out, bright and numerous against the inky black sky. That night, as we lay in the tent, the stillness of the forest began to feel oppressive, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making even the faintest sound unnerving. I drifted in and out of sleep, the distant rustle of leaves occasionally pulling me back to wakefulness. Around midnight, I heard it, Mark's sharp intake of breath beside me. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. He had unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Where there had been only trees and shadows earlier, there was now a cabin, a small wooden structure, its silhouette illuminated by the pale light of the moon, stood less than 50 yards from our tent. It hadn't been there before. "That's not possible," I whispered. "We walked this entire area earlier. There was nothing here." Mark nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the cabin. Maybe we missed it, but we both knew that wasn't true. The clearing had been empty, the ground undisturbed. My gut told me something was wrong, but curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at our skin. The cabin loomed in front of us, its windows dark and its wooden frame weathered and worn. "Let's just take a quick look," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. We approached cautiously, the crunch of leaves under our boots loud in the silence. The door creaked open with a push, revealing an interior lit faintly by the moonlight streaming through a cracked window. The cabin smelled of damp wood and decay, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with old jars and trinkets. A table stood in the center of the room, and on it lay a single object, a leather-bound book. Mark picked it up, the leather cracked and brittle under his fingers. He flipped it open, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. This doesn't make any sense," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He held the book out to me, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with names, neatly written in faded ink. Names and dates, stretching back decades, maybe even centuries. And then I saw it, our names, written in the same delicate script. Mark Evans, Lena Carter. The date beside them was today. I felt the blood drain from my face. How is this possible? We've never been here before. No one knew we were coming. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the last entry in the book, written below our names. It wasn't a name this time, just a single sentence. "They are watching." We both turned instinctively toward the window. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and for a moment, everything seemed still. But then I saw it, shadows moving between the trees, tall, slender shapes that moved unnaturally, their limbs too long and their heads tilted as if they were listening. My breath caught in my throat as one of them stepped closer, its face obscured by the darkness, but its intent unmistakable. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice barely audible. We bolted from the cabin, leaving the book on the table. The shadows seemed to follow, their movements silent but relentless. We stumbled back to the tent, grabbing only what we could carry before sprinting down the trail. The forest, once a haven, now felt like a trap, the trees closing in around us as the shadows grew closer. By the time we reached the car, the first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. The memory of the cabin and the shadows etched into our minds. The next day, we returned to the spot with a group of locals. We didn't expect to find anything, but some part of me hoped we had imagined it all, that exhaustion or fear had played tricks on our minds. But when we reached the clearing, it was empty. No cabin. No sign of anyone or anything having been there. The ground was undisturbed. The forest eerily quiet. I told myself it didn't matter, that we were safe now. But some nights, when the world is silent and the shadows grow long, I think of that cabin and the book with our names. I wonder who or what wrote them, and I wonder if they're still watching. Story number 2. The Man with Red Eyes. The Appalachian Mountains were silent that night, their vast forest shrouded in an almost oppressive darkness. Our group, Nick, Amy, Rachel, and I had settled into camp after a long day of hiking. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. It was our second night, and the solitude of the wilderness felt comforting. At least, it did until the first sound came. A faint rustling echoed from the edge of the clearing. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. Could have been the wind or an animal moving through the leaves, but something about it felt deliberate. Amy noticed it too, her eyes scanning the treeline. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nick shrugged, grabbing a flashlight. "Probably just a deer." He turned the beam toward the forest, its light cutting through the shadows. At first, there was nothing, just trees and the silver glint of frost on the leaves. Then I saw it. A figure stood motionless just beyond the reach of the firelight, tall and thin, its outline barely distinguishable from the trees. Nick called out, "Who's there?" His voice carried confidence, but I could see his hand shaking slightly as he held the flashlight. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence unnerving in its stillness. The flashlight beam finally caught its face. It was a man, or something resembling one. His features were gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were the worst part, burning red, like glowing embers. They pierced through the darkness, locking onto us with an intensity that made my stomach twist. No one spoke. No one moved. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. No one reacted, so I shouted, "Run!" and bolted from the clearing, the others scrambling to follow. We ran blindly, the trail disappearing beneath our frantic footsteps. The forest closed in around us, branches clawing at our faces and packs as we pushed forward. Behind us, the sound of crunching leaves followed, steady and relentless. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence, the weight of those red eyes boring into my back. The laughter began as we reached a narrow ravine. It was low and guttural at first, more of a growl than a laugh, but it grew louder, echoing through the trees. I stumbled, nearly falling, and Nick grabbed my arm to steady me. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice shaking. The trail led us to a small clearing, where we collapsed in exhaustion. For a moment, the footsteps and laughter stopped, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. Amy's eyes darted around the clearing, her face pale. "Do you think we lost him?" she whispered. A low chuckle came from the darkness. The man stepped into the clearing, his red eyes glowing brighter than before. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. The firelight caught the edges of his face again, and his smile widened, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. I grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We have to go," I said, barely able to keep the panic out of my voice. We ran again, leaving behind our gear and the remnants of the fire. The laughter followed, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely. The forest seemed alive, the shadows shifting and stretching as if trying to trap us. When we finally stumbled onto a gravel road, the first hints of dawn breaking on the horizon. We didn't stop. We ran until we reached our car, threw ourselves inside, and drove as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. The silence in the car was heavy, none of us daring to speak until we were miles away. "What was he?" Rachel finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. We never went back to that trail, leaving our gear and whatever semblance of bravery we had behind. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what happened, to fit it into some logical explanation. But every time I close my eyes and remember those red eyes burning through the darkness, logic slips away. The mountains are vast, filled with beauty and mystery, but they also hold shadows, things we aren't meant to see or understand. If you ever find yourself camping deep in the Appalachian wilderness, remember this: not all who watch from the shadows are human, and some roads are better left untrodden. Story number 3. The Song in the Snow. Winter in Vermont can be both enchanting and unforgiving. The snow blankets everything in a hushed stillness, turning even the most familiar places into landscapes of eerie beauty. In December 1998, my family decided to embrace the season by going on a winter camping trip. It was meant to be a bonding experience, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life and reconnect with nature in its purest form. We were a group of 7: my parents, my uncle Rob and his wife Sandra, and their teenage son Jack, along with my younger sister Lily and me. We chose a remote spot in the Green Mountain National Forest, a place far enough from civilization to promise solitude but close enough to a trailhead that we could retreat if the weather turned dangerous. The first 2 days were idyllic. The forest was a winter wonderland, the snow pristine and untouched. We built a roaring fire each night, swapping stories and sipping hot cocoa as the stars glittered above us. It felt like a perfect escape until the third night. The first note. It began as a faint sound, so faint I thought I was imagining it. We were sitting around the fire, the flames crackling and casting long shadows over the snow. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches of the towering pines around us. That's when I heard it, a soft, lilting melody, barely audible over the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked, looking around at the others. "Hear what?" my dad replied, glancing at me curiously. "It sounds like singing," I said. Sandra frowned, tilting her head as if to listen. "It's probably just the wind. It can make strange sounds in the trees." I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right, but the unease in my chest lingered. The sound didn't stop. If anything, it grew more distinct. It wasn't the random howl of wind through the trees but something deliberate, haunting, a woman's voice singing a slow, mournful tune. The words, if there were any, were indistinguishable, but the melody carried an undeniable sadness. The search. By the time we retreated to our tents, the singing had become impossible to ignore. It seemed to echo through the forest, surrounding us from all sides. My uncle Rob, ever the pragmatist, decided to investigate. "It's probably some hiker or local playing a joke," he said, pulling on his coat and grabbing a flashlight. "I'll go check it out." My aunt protested, but Rob was insistent. He reassured her he wouldn't go far, just far enough to find the source of the sound. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, he promised. We watched as his flashlight beam disappeared into the trees, the singing seeming to draw him deeper into the forest. The rest of us huddled around the fire, the warmth doing little to ease the chill creeping into my bones. The minutes dragged on, and Rob didn't return. "We should go after him," Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. "No," my dad replied firmly. "We wait." He said 10 minutes. Let's give him a little more time. But 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was almost worse. The fire crackled, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Finally, my dad stood, grabbing his own flashlight. "I'm going to look for him," he said. "No!" Sandra cried, grabbing his arm. "If something happened to Rob, we need to stay together." Reluctantly, my dad agreed, and we decided to wait until morning when it would be safer to search. None of us slept that night. The forest felt alive with an unseen presence, and the silence pressed against us like a physical weight. The discovery, the first light. We split into two groups to search for Rob. My dad, Jack, and I took one direction, while Sandra and my mom stayed back with Lily. The snow made it easy to follow his trail. The crunch of our boots the only sound in the frozen stillness. We found him just before noon. He was lying in a small clearing, his body curled as if he had simply lain down to sleep. His face was peaceful, almost serene, but his skin was pale and cold as the snow beneath him. There were no signs of injury, no evidence of a struggle. The only explanation was the cold. Yet Rob had been dressed for the weather. His flashlight lay nearby, its beam extinguished, and his footprints led in a straight line to this spot, as if he had willingly walked here to meet his fate. We stood in stunned silence, the reality of his death settling over us like a suffocating fog. My dad knelt beside him, checking for any sign of life, but it was too late. "What could have happened?" Jack asked, his voice breaking. He was fine. He knew how to handle the cold. I looked around the clearing, searching for anything that could explain his death. That's when I saw it, tracks in the snow. Faint but unmistakable. They weren't human, nor were they animal. They were long, narrow, and pointed, like nothing I had ever seen before. They surrounded Rob's body, circling him as if something had been watching him before it vanished into the trees. The aftermath. We left the forest that same day, abandoning our camp and carrying Rob's body back to the trailhead. The authorities ruled his death as hypothermia, a tragic but not uncommon fate in the harsh Vermont winter. But none of us could shake the feeling that something more had happened. The singing haunted me for weeks after. I would hear it in the quiet moments before sleep, a faint melody just at the edge of my consciousness. Sandra moved away not long after, unable to stay in the town where she had lost her husband. Jack stopped speaking to all of us, his grief manifesting in silence. Years later, I returned to that forest, drawn by a need for answers I knew I might never find. The clearing where we found Rob was unchanged, the snow pristine as if no one had ever been there. But as I stood there, I felt it, the same oppressive silence, the same sense of being watched. And then, faint and far away, I heard it, the singing. I didn't stay to listen. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. A trick of the wind? A shared hallucination brought on by the cold? Or something older? Something that lures the unwary into the trees with a song too beautiful to resist? If you ever find yourself in the Green Mountain National Forest, and you hear singing on the wind, remember this: beauty can be a trap, and some songs are meant to be left unheard. Story number 4. The Lights on the Ice. January 2010. Iceland is a land of fire and ice, a stark and hauntingly beautiful landscape where nature's extremes collide. I had always been drawn to its wild, untouched terrain, and that winter, I convinced a group of friends, Alex, Ingrid, and Tom, to join me on a backcountry skiing expedition across the frozen expanse of Lake Maiven. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to test ourselves against the elements and witness the auroras dancing across the Arctic sky. The first few days were everything we had hoped for. The days were short but breathtaking, the low sun casting long shadows over the snow-covered lake. The nights were cold but rewarding, the sky alight with ribbons of green and purple that shimmered and pulsed like a living thing. We skied hard during the daylight hours and spent the evenings huddled in our tents, sharing stories and marveling at the otherworldly beauty around us. It was on the third night that things took a turn. The wind had died down, leaving the frozen lake eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing seem loud. We had pitched our tents in the middle of the lake, miles from the shore, the ice beneath us thick and solid. After dinner, we retreated to our tents, the bitter cold seeping into the fabric despite our best efforts to stay warm. I was just beginning to drift off when Alex's voice broke the quiet. "Guys, come out here. You need to see this." Groaning, I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled out of the tent, my breath visible in the freezing air. Ingrid and Tom joined us, their faces lit by the soft glow of the lantern Alex held. He pointed towards the horizon, and my irritation faded as I saw what had drawn him out. First, I thought it was the aurora borealis, a faint, shimmering green light dancing low on the horizon. But as I watched, I realized these lights were different. They were smaller, more localized, and moved in a way that didn't match the flowing ribbons of the aurora. They pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and seemed to hover just above the surface of the ice. "What do you think it is?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with awe. "Some kind of natural phenomenon?" Ingrid suggested. "Reflections? Gas emissions?" "Maybe," Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But it's weird, right?" We stood there for what felt like hours, watching the lights dance and pulse. They seemed to grow brighter, more vivid, as if they were aware of our presence. Then, to our collective disbelief, they began to move, slowly at first, then faster. They glided across the ice, heading straight for us. "Back to the tents," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Now." We scrambled back inside, zipping the doors shut and huddling together in silence. The lights grew closer, their glow seeping through the thin fabric of the tents. The air inside felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Do you hear that?" Ingrid whispered. We strained our ears, and then we heard it, a faint, high-pitched hum, like the sound of a tuning fork vibrating just out of reach. The sound seemed to emanate from the ice itself, growing louder and more insistent as the lights outside grew brighter. Then came the touch. It was light, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a pressure on my shoulder, as though someone had placed their hand there. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one behind me. My friends stared at me, their eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" Alex asked. "Something touched me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not funny, man," Tom said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his unease. "I'm not joking," I snapped. Someone touched me, before anyone could respond. The humming intensified, the lights outside flashing in rapid, erratic bursts. The tent seemed to vibrate, the fabric straining against an unseen force. I felt the pressure again, this time on my back, as though something was pressing against the tent wall from the outside. "Get out!" I shouted, unzipping the door and stumbling into the freezing night. The others followed, their faces pale as they stared at the lights now swirling around us in a dizzying pattern. They moved faster than before, their glow so bright it hurt to look at. The hum had become a roar, the ice beneath us vibrating as though something massive was moving below. "What do we do?" Ingrid shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Run!" Alex yelled. "Get to the shore!" We grabbed what we could and ran, the cold biting at our exposed skin as we stumbled across the ice. The lights followed us, darting and weaving like predators playing with their prey. The roaring sound seemed to come from everywhere, an oppressive force that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. As we neared the edge of the lake, the lights suddenly stopped. They hovered for a moment, their glow dimming, before retreating back towards the center of the lake. The roaring ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more oppressive than the noise had. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the trees, collapsing in a heap and gasping for breath. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of what we had experienced settling over us like a heavy blanket. The next morning, we packed up what little we had left behind and left the lake without looking back. The memory of those lights, the hum, the touch, haunted us for the rest of the trip and long after we returned home. To this day, I don't know what we saw on that frozen lake. Was it a natural phenomenon, Something rare and unexplained? Or was it something else? Something not meant to be seen by human eyes? Whatever it was, it left a mark on all of us. A reminder that there are places in this world that don't belong to us, where the rules of nature bend and break in ways we can't understand. And if you ever find yourself camping on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere, be wary of the lights that dance on the ice. They may be beautiful, but beauty can be deceiving. Sometimes, the things that glow the brightest hide the darkest secrets. Story number 5. The Forgotten Shelter. January 2003. Colorado's wilderness in the dead of winter is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. Miles of snow-covered forest stretch out in all directions, the stillness broken only by the occasional crack of ice or the distant cry of a bird. I'm Eric McAllister, an avid outdoorsman, and that year, I convinced my friends Mark, Lisa, and Jamie to join me for a winter camping trip in the remote foothills of the Rockies. We wanted adventure, an escape from the mundane, and the kind of solitude you can only find in the heart of nature. We set out early on a cold, clear morning, our packs laden with supplies and our spirits high. The hike was challenging but exhilarating, the crisp air filling our lungs as we trekked deeper into the wilderness. By late afternoon, we had reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the perfect spot to set up camp. The snow was thick but manageable, and the view of the distant mountains bathed in the golden light of the setting sun was breathtaking. That first night was uneventful. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughing as the flames cast flickering shadows on the snow. The cold was biting, but the warmth of the fire and the camaraderie kept it at bay. As the night deepened, we retreated to our tents, lulled to sleep by the soothing stillness of the forest. The next day, we decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest felt endless, the trees stretching skyward like silent sentinels. It was Lisa who spotted it first, a dark shape partially obscured by the snow and undergrowth. As we drew closer, we realized it was an old, weathered tent, its fabric sagging under the weight of years of neglect. "Who do you think left it here?" Jamie asked, brushing snow off the entrance. "Probably a hunter or another camper," Mark replied. "Looks like it's been here for a while." Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. The tent was surprisingly intact, though the fabric was faded and torn in places. Inside, we found an assortment of personal items, a rusted flashlight, a torn sleeping bag, and a few scattered cans of food, long past their expiration date. But it was the notebook lying in the corner that drew our attention. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. Flipping through it, we realized it was a journal, its entries scrawled in shaky handwriting. The first few pages detailed what seemed to be a solo camping trip, the author describing the beauty of the wilderness and their excitement at being away from civilization. But as the entries continued, the tone shifted. December 20th. The snow is heavier than I expected. My supplies are running low, but I think I can make it back to the trailhead tomorrow. The forest is so quiet, almost too quiet. December 21st. I've lost the trail. Everything looks the same, and the snow is falling harder. I tried retracing my steps, but they were already gone by the time I turned around. I'm starting to panic. December 22nd. I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. I've heard things, branches snapping, soft footsteps in the snow. Every time I look, there's nothing there. Am I imagining it? The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting more erratic. The author described hearing voices, faint at first but growing louder each night. They wrote of shadows moving through the trees, always just out of sight, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. December 24th. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever it is away. It didn't help. I heard them last night, closer than ever. Whispers, so many whispers, like the forest is alive. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. December 25th. I hear them. They're coming. If anyone finds this, please. The writing ended abruptly, the pen dragging off the page as if ripped from the author's hand. We stared at the journal in stunned silence, the weight of its words settling heavily over us. The forest, which had seemed so serene just hours ago, now felt oppressive, the towering trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. "We should leave," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." "Come on," Mark replied, trying to sound confident but failing. "It's just a story. The guy probably got spooked and left." "Then where is he?" Jamie shot back. "His stuff is still here. If he made it out, wouldn't he have taken his gear?" None of us had an answer. That night, the forest came alive. As we huddled around the fire, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and carrying with it faint, unplaceable sounds. At first, it was just the creak of branches swaying in the wind. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling our campsite. We froze, straining to hear, our eyes darting to the edge of the firelight. The footsteps stopped, replaced by whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the trees but revealing nothing. "Did you see that?" Jamie whispered, pointing toward the shadows. I followed his gaze and caught a glimpse of movement, something tall and dark, slipping between the trees. It was gone before I could get a good look, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of understanding. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in a tight circle around the fire, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. By morning, we had made our decision. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, leaving the cursed tent and its journal behind. The hike back to the trailhead was tense, every step accompanied by the feeling of unseen eyes watching us. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, now felt hostile, the silence heavy with unspoken menace. We didn't stop until we reached the car, our breaths visible in the cold air as we piled in and drove away without looking back. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. The journal, the whispers, the shadows, they're things I can't explain, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that something is out there, something that doesn't want to be found. And if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness, far from the safety of civilization, remember this: some places are meant to be left alone. The forest has its secrets, and not all of them are meant for us to uncover. Story number 6. The Watcher on the Summit. March 1997. Alaska's mountains are a world unto themselves, vast, untamed, and indifferent to the struggles of those who dare to traverse them. My name is Daniel Walsh, and I've always been drawn to the wild, remote corners of the earth. That year, I convinced 3 of my closest friends, Ryan, Beth, and Mike, to join me on an expedition to climb an unnamed peak in the Chugach Range. It wasn't the tallest or most technical climb, but it promised solitude, challenge, and the kind of beauty only found in nature's most unforgiving places. We began our ascent under a pale winter sun, the snow crunching underfoot as we trudged upwards, weighed down by packs filled with gear and provisions. The air was sharp and clean, the silence broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the distant call of a raven. By the 3rd day, we had reached a plateau just below the summit, where we set up camp for the night, our tents huddled together against the biting wind, and the view stretched endlessly. A sea of jagged peaks and glacial valleys bathed in the cold light of the setting sun. That evening, as we sat around a small stove, the mood was light. Ryan told one of his infamous campfire stories, a tale about an old Alaskan legend, the Shadow Watcher. According to local lore, it was a spirit that guarded the mountains, watching over climbers and judging their worth. Those deemed unworthy would disappear, their bodies never found, their souls claimed by the icy wilderness. Beth rolled her eyes, dismissing it as a campfire scare tactic. but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the mountains, silent and vast, held secrets we weren't meant to uncover. We retreated to our tents as the temperature dropped, the stars glittering like shards of ice against the black sky. The wind howled around us, tugging at the fabric of the tents and carrying with it the whispers of the wild. Despite my exhaustion, sleep was elusive, my mind racing with anticipation for the summit attempt the next morning. Sometime in the dead of night, I awoke to the sound of Ryan unzipping the tent door. "What are you doing?" I mumbled groggily. "Just stepping out for a minute," he whispered back, his breath visible in the frigid air. I drifted back into a restless sleep, only to be awakened moments later by Ryan shaking my shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. "Dan," he said, his voice trembling, "you need to see this." Reluctantly, I crawled out of my sleeping bag, the cold biting at my skin as I followed him outside. The night was unnervingly still, the wind having died down to an almost oppressive silence. Ryan pointed towards a nearby peak, its snow-covered slope glowing faintly under the moonlight. At first, I didn't see it. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, scanning the rocky outcrop. Then I saw it, a tall, shadowy figure standing motionless on the summit. It was humanoid in shape but impossibly large, its proportions exaggerated in a way that defied logic. It stood completely still, this dark form stark against the pale snow, as though it were carved from the mountain itself. "What the hell?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. "It's been standing there for the last 10 minutes, Ryan said. "It hasn't moved. It's just watching us." Beth and Mike joined us, drawn by our hushed voices, and they too fell silent as they spotted the figure. We stared in a mixture of awe and dread, none of us daring to speak, as if our voices might provoke whatever it was. The figure didn't move, didn't waver, but there was an undeniable presence to it, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on us, as though it were more than just a shadow. "Could it be another climber?" Beth finally asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "No way," Mike replied. "No one else is out here, and even if they were, how would they get up there without leaving tracks?" He was right. The snow was pristine, untouched by any sign of passage. The sheer impossibility of the figure's presence only deepened our unease. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow seemed to dissolve into the night, melting into the darkness as though it had never been there. We stood frozen, unsure of what to do, until Beth finally spoke. "We need to get some sleep," she said, though her voice wavered. "We'll figure it out in the morning." Reluctantly, we returned to our tents. Though none of us slept much that night, the sense of being watched lingered, the silence of the mountains now feeling oppressive, almost malevolent. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been a warning, a silent sentinel reminding us that we were trespassers in a realm not meant for us. When dawn broke, we set out to investigate. The climb to the nearby peak was treacherous, the snow deep and the wind biting. As we reached the summit, the view was breathtaking, but our eyes were drawn to the spot where the figure had stood. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance, only smooth, untouched snow as far as the eye could see. "It's impossible," Ryan muttered, his breath fogging in the cold air. "There's no way something could have stood here without leaving tracks." We searched the area thoroughly, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone, no explanation for what we had seen. The sense of unease grew with every passing moment, and by unspoken agreement, we decided to abandon our summit attempt and descend the mountain. The journey back to base camp was fraught with tension. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried whispers we couldn't quite hear. The mountain, once a place of beauty and challenge, now felt hostile, as though it were trying to push us away. When we finally returned to civilization, we shared our story with a few locals. Most dismissed it as exhaustion or a trick of the light, but one old mountaineer listened intently, his expression grave. "You saw the Watcher," he said matter-of-factly. It doesn't like people being up there. Some say it's a spirit, others a guardian. Whatever it is, it's been there long before any of us. His words offered no comfort, only confirming what we had feared, that we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something ancient and unknowable, a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's vast indifference. I haven't returned to the Chugach Range since that trip, and I doubt I ever will. The mountains hold a beauty that is undeniable, but they also hold secrets, shadows that linger just out of sight. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out my window, expecting to see that figure standing on a distant peak, watching, waiting. And if you ever find yourself climbing in the remote wilderness of Alaska, remember this: the mountains are alive in ways we cannot comprehend. Respect them, tread carefully, and never ignore the feeling that you're being watched. Story number 7. The Whispering Snow. February 2015. Canada's wilderness is vast. A frozen expanse of snow-covered forests and icy rivers that stretch endlessly, swallowing sound and light in its wintry embrace. I'm Jason Carter, an outdoor enthusiast with a penchant for adventure and a knack for convincing my friends to join me on trips they might otherwise avoid. This time, it was supposed to be a simple winter camping trip, a few nights under the stars in a remote area of Ontario, the perfect way to escape the monotony of our everyday lives. There were 4 of us: myself, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Sarah, and Emily, a mutual friend who was always up for an adventure. We were experienced campers, confident in our ability to handle the cold and the solitude of the Canadian wilderness. Armed with gear, provisions, and the kind of bravado only 20-somethings possess, we drove deep into the forest, far from the last signs of civilization. The first day was beautiful. The snow sparkled under a pale winter sun, the air crisp and clean. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. Our tents formed a small semicircle around a fire pit, where we spent the evening sharing stories and laughing as the flames flickered and danced. Felt perfect, tranquil, untouched, and utterly ours. But as the fire died down and we retreated to our tents, the sense of peace began to shift. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible change in the air. The wind seemed quieter, the forest too still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I was the first to hear it, a soft crunching sound, faint but distinct, breaking the silence of the night. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer or perhaps a fox moving through the snow, but the steps were too deliberate, too slow, circling our campsite in a way that no animal would. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Mark, who was sharing a tent with me. He froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was walking just outside the tent. I unzipped the door slightly, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground, but there was nothing there. No shadowy figures, no movement, just the pristine white expanse of snow, undisturbed. "There's nothing out there," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Probably just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. The footsteps continued sporadically throughout the night, stopping and starting without warning. We didn't sleep much, our nerves frayed by the persistent crunching and the unsettling sense of being watched. The next morning, we searched the area around the campsite, expecting to find tracks in the snow. But there was nothing. The ground was untouched, the snow as smooth and perfect as when we had arrived. It didn't make sense. We tried to laugh it off, blaming our overactive imaginations and the eeriness of the forest. But an unspoken tension lingered between us as we prepared for the day ahead. That evening, the mood around the campfire was subdued. The laughter and stories from the night before were replaced with quiet conversation and frequent glances over our shoulders. The forest felt different, heavier, as if it were closing in around us. We decided to call it an early night, retreating to the false safety of our tents. It didn't take long for the footsteps to return. This time, they were louder, more insistent, circling closer and closer to the tents. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Deep, ragged breaths, just inches from the thin fabric of the tent. "Jason," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, too terrified to speak. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, accompanied by the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were miles from civilization, surrounded by darkness and the unrelenting cold. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the campsite, followed by a sharp scraping sound that made my skin crawl. Sarah screamed from the other tent, and Mark bolted upright, fumbling for the flashlight. I unzipped the tent door and shone the light outside, my hands shaking. The beam illuminated the snow, revealing nothing, no footprints, no signs of disturbance, just the untouched expanse of white. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm despite the fear that gripped me. "Now." We hurriedly packed our gear, abandoning the tents and leaving behind anything we couldn't carry. The sense of urgency was palpable, a primal instinct screaming at us to get out. The footsteps continued as we moved, shadowing us through the forest, always just out of sight. The trek back to the car was harrowing. The trail we had followed so easily before now felt labyrinthine, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The breathing persisted, faint but present, as if whatever was following us was toying with us, letting us know we couldn't escape. When we finally reached the car, we piled in without a word, slamming the doors and locking them as if that thin barrier of metal and glass could protect us. As Mark started the engine, I glanced back at the trail we had just emerged from. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, a tall, shadowy shape watching us with hollow eyes. We drove away as fast as the icy roads allowed, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken fear. None of us looked back, too afraid of what we might see. We never returned to that campsite. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but there were no logical explanations. No animal could have made those sounds without leaving tracks. No person could have survived in those conditions without a trace. It was as if the forest itself had come alive. Its cold, unyielding presence a reminder of how small and vulnerable we truly were. Years later, I still think about that trip. The footsteps, the breathing, the inexplicable sense of being watched. It all lingers in the back of my mind, a haunting memory I can't shake. I've been camping since, but I never feel entirely at ease, especially when the snow falls and the forest grows quiet. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I think I can hear it, the faint crunch of footsteps on snow, circling, always circling, just out of sight.